I think what's become evident over the past few years is that we've overcorrected. That's my assessment, is that there absolutely is no denying huge problems with speech online. I think there's been however, been an overcorrection, and actually that has real world consequences in terms of, well, in some ways, what oftentimes turned out to be misinformation about the pandemic, for example, and what people were being told at the start by the official guidance ended up being wrong 6 months later. But Twitter and others were taking it down because it was considered misinformation at the time. So that's obviously huge in terms of when you're dealing with a pandemic. In some ways, I think you're just talking about lesser evils at the end of the day, and I think the lesser evil is free speech, because once you have a kind of small group of people managing and controlling what you can and cannot say, the way that can be weaponized to control society at large is a much more terrifying prospect.
So what time is it in Tasmania?
It is 9 a.m.
Tomorrow? It's
tomorrow. I'm in the future.
It's the 28th. That always weirds me out. But how's it going tomorrow?
How is it like? What's it like in the future? It's actually not that different to the past in some ways, at least the most immediate past.
Do you want us to do anything for you here in the past?
Oh, there's so much to fix, but it can all go wrong as well.
How long have you been living there?
Well, I grew up here, so I came back because of the pandemic, and prior to the pandemic I was living in Bangkok.
Right.
Andrew is the co-founder, as you know, and the executive director of EngageMedia.
Yeah. Why was it necessary to set it up, and why were you the person to run it? And what is it? Start with that.
Sure. So EngageMedia is a nonprofit organization that supports human rights and environmental advocates in the Asia Pacific, primarily by increasing their media and technology capacity. But more specifically, we work around the issues of digital rights and open and secure technology. So things like mis and disinformation, privacy, surveillance, your kind of various rights online. We work a lot with kind of open source, free and open source technologies and Creative Commons and that type of approach to doing work and open knowledge, etc. So more and more people have access to information and the technologies that could ideally improve their lives. Not always, but often. But really the gap or the need that we saw, because we started in 2005, the initial impetus was to create a platform for sharing social issue documentary, in fact, from around the Asia Pacific, because YouTube did not exist at this point. We'd been working a lot around social issue documentary, or just, social issue films more broadly, not solely documentary, for some time, and also had come from various tech backgrounds and thought, let's create a platform not focused just on Australia, which is where I'm from, but something that also is connecting Australia more effectively to Asia. Also because there were lots and lots of changes happening around how do you call it, the personal media revolution. There are lots of different ways to think about it, where people had access to cheap cameras and phones, and then obviously people could more and more edit on their laptops. Now it just seems totally normal. But in 2005, the shift that it was happening was, now we can edit on our own laptops. We don't need to have so much these kind of community centers to broadcast. We're shifting away from kind of more community TV or ways of doing things and jumping on the internet as the bandwidth was increasing. And so there was an opportunity there in terms of what the technology was enabling to change who was telling the story, and also who got more attention. So us as Australians, in terms of our relationship with Asia, had very much been, a foreign correspondent from Sydney goes and, lives in Jakarta or Manila or whatever it might be, and reports back and tells the world what's going on. Obviously, that has radically changed now, but in 2005, it was just beginning to, where suddenly it was possible to hear the voices of people from the places themselves much, much more easily. So we wanted to think about a platform that would enable that to happen more regularly.
So Creative Commons is a system of talking about how we share things, right? Where with an understanding where you don't have to check with me because you understand the license.
Yep.
And that's sort of a legal framework. Even if you're doing that over a set of different countries, I think there's probably some underlying complexity to how that's set up. But in essence, that's a legal framework. And it seems like you're setting up an organization that's going to think about how people share this media. How does your organization go from, well, we're just a platform to use, to, hey, let's celebrate this particular filmmaker in our system?
So, I mean, I think the ones that most align with the work that we ourselves are trying to do and the issues that we're focused on would be one thing. Oftentimes, it's also like the quality of the content and what we see as its potential. So at the moment, the original platform, which was on EngageMedia.org, has now shifted to a new space that we've developed called cinemata.org, which features all those different films. And so, potential for impact, audience reach, timeliness in terms of the necessity of the content. Is it speaking to an issue that is particularly of great interest to people, or one that we think should be of more issues? So we have a small team that's constantly out there curating and then distributing and engaging people with this content in order for it to create more impact.
So over these years that you've been doing this, did you ever bring these filmmakers together? Did they ever meet in person?
Yes. Yeah. So, and actually a lot of the work we ended up doing was actually about events. So I would almost say our event expertise is as much as our kind of technology or media expertise. So we started this network called Transmission in 2006. And actually that was our first event in this case, it was actually in Rome. And it was more of a global event, and it brought together open source technology developers who were building ways of distributing video content online that didn't rely on proprietary platforms or even proprietary codecs. So there are a lot of people developing open source codecs and getting pretty geeky with that. But then in the region as well, we also had similar events where we were bringing together documentary filmmakers. We'd generally take them out of the city and we'd avoid doing conference style things. So we had them up on the side of a volcano in Western Java for a week and put up army tents and had like little computer labs and spaces for workshops in there that brought together about 60 people. But we did similar events in Myanmar, outside of Manila, several more, another one in Malaysia, where we're really trying to bring those people together and build the physical connections that then had the capacity to grow and expand virtually after the event.
I have a question around, when you started, of course, the world is very different, very different. But some of the countries that you're talking about where some of the people are coming from now, it would be very dangerous for them. They couldn't come, and some of the topics that they're talking about if you're defending your rights or you're even just documenting what's going on in your country at that point. So I have kind of two questions. How has the rise of the crackdown that we're seeing, the rise of authoritarianism and all of that impact kind of the stories that are being told?
Must be much more complicated in Myanmar right now, no?
Well,
exactly. Rohingya represented?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to hear the pattern.
So, I mean, it's interesting because there are these waves. So if I think 2005, 2006 to now, in Indonesia, say there were periods of more repression, and then there were periods of kind of greater opening up and less authoritarianism. Now it's kind of pushing back towards more authoritarianism. There was a period, obviously, 2005-06, Myanmar was very much under dictatorship. There was 7-8 years where it was kind of opened again. Now it's gone back. So we're certainly on a kind of increased authoritarianism wave. I think COVID also pushed that along, also because the kind of travel restrictions and it was decimated a lot of the tourism industry. So there are a lot of economic downturn across the region, but also the kind of crisis mentality enabled, strong men for the most part to step in and say, we'll take charge and look after things and don't disobey and question us. And a lot of people will in a crisis obviously rally around that kind of thing. So there's certainly a lot of risk as well. And that's also why when we started originally, we were, starting around this kind of social issue film work with obviously a strong technical component because it was all about the online. But the 2005, 6, 7 was a much more utopian period about the possibilities of the internet.
Remember that? Remember those days? Everything was open source and everybody was going to share.
And that's obviously changed now. And so as we realized that, we thought we can't just say, hey, come onto the internet, everything's going to be fine, we'll be empowered and we'll build more democracy, et cetera, actually became a much more pessimistic space that required more defensive mechanisms as well.
Just because we're talking about Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, the hero, and then she becomes a villain. How do you maintain, and you stand for a certain set of values, but in all these countries, you do have changing governments? Is it hard to maintain the values that you want, or does the group, sort of keep itself organized?
I mean, I think for our values, it's fairly easy that the world oscillates around us. I don't think our kind of original commitments around free media, freedom of expression, open source technologies, privacy and others have really changed particularly much. If anything, they're more relevant than before. We often had a challenge at the start trying to convince people that the big tech platforms were a problem. We were kind of saying stuff in 2005, 6, 7, telling people, oh, this whole YouTube, Facebook thing, everyone was getting very, very excited. Maybe there's some downsides. Yeah. We should also be a little bit more critical. And everyone's like, no, it's all going to be fine. Stop being a party pooper, etc. So, I think it impacts in the sense of, I think Priscilla's question earlier, where the kind of security profile of the environment changes dramatically. And I mean, someone like Aung San Suu Kyi is a complicated character where, sometimes obviously it's, she should not be in jail, just to be clear, but she also kind of let the Rohingya thing, was willing to make that compromise around that as well. So if you're looking for kind of very clear ethics or morality, then I mean, I think it's very difficult to find that.
I guess my second question, though, is around this idea of digital rights, right? And at certain point, it was access to the internet is one of the, rights that, and so how are we doing big picture right now? We think about what's happening over part of the world, where there's a war being waged and sort of access to information, freedom of expression not happening in some places. But in general, what are people do they have the right to have their story? Do they have the right to do they have their digital rights, or are they being monitored? Like just a snap?
No, I would say for the most part, it's a fairly negative landscape. Things have changed quite dramatically. I mean, if you kind of to do an audit and go through, think about the region, then obviously in places like Vietnam, probably some of the worst, along with of course Myanmar, other places a bit more open like the Philippines and Indonesia, but it is generally not advancing. There was a kind of period of advancement in the, very broadly speaking, that kind of 2008 to 2018, it was really started going backwards. But the prices really vary in terms of what will happen to people. In Thailand, it could be 20 years in jail for what might be perceived as an insult to the king.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, each society has its own, set of values and things that it thinks about. So as an organization, does that make it difficult to interface with them? They each get to decide what their society should be like. So what's the role of an organization in terms of...
No, I agree, because you have to be very careful as well, because I mean, I don't look like most of the organization. Just the Philippine team is all Filipinos, and the Thai team is all Thais, and the Malaysian team is all Malaysians, etc. And they all have different contexts, and they have to balance what is the kind of appropriate way for them to do their work in their context, which might look very different. And also, but the funders often are Western, and they will bring their own morality and ethics and what they think is right and wrong into these other societies. And sometimes they will fit, but sometimes it won't always fit as well. And so we're in this intermediate role. I mean, for the most part, we're trying to encourage that funding space to be more centered around what's happening in the various country contexts and cultural contexts, but they also have, the kind of European and US donors that have their own agendas as well. So it's not like it's the funding space is completely agendaless. In fact, it's not agendaless in any way, shape or form. It's really about trying to have a match. So in some ways, when people talk about, this is foreign intervention, I mean, on some levels, if a big donor from the US is giving money to organizations in the Philippines or Thailand, etc., then that is someone from outside who is making an intervention. So how do you, and I think it is a really good question, like how do you actually justify that? For us, because we would kind of receive some of their money, it's that we're very much kind of based in what the local needs are and taking direction from them, and also trying to firewall where those funders might have agendas that really don't fit with what's going on in whatever that cultural or local country context is. So it's definitely an absolute balance and a tightrope to walk that you don't always get right.
It's really interesting to think about it. And again, going back to some of the earlier days, and Jesse, when you were at the Berkman Center, also we'd have those we'd go to TED 15, 20 years ago, and people were so excited. But you're a person in your society, in your country. That's one thing in the real world, or in the analog world, and then you're a person in your digital life. And so, who owns you? That there was, I think, at that point, it was like we're all part of that community, that digital global community, and not. I mean, I think that was the dream.
It's like the greatest minds of this generation were lost on search algorithms or something for advertising. It's like,
well, I know, but I mean, it did really
change.
Really changed a lot. So where do you, like, where are we?
I mean, all these big, the Facebooks and, Instagram and, all these things are so difficult to navigate as a human being. It's like, we'll see what Elon Musk does with Twitter, but it's like, at least he says the right things, about it being freedom and, and not judging the speech. We'll see whether he actually, I bet he'll actually come close. What are your thoughts on that?
On Elon?
Well, with Twitter specifically,
I mean, I think there's been a total really strange shift in the digital rights space, which from a perspective of working in the Asia Pacific looks really weird. So the US and Europe has gotten very much into content moderation as a way to manage difficult or, well, often downright horrible content online, right? And the result and the ways that can contribute to discrimination and other social ills that are very much obviously in need of rectifying. In a context of someone in Indonesia, that I would, not to speak for Indonesian, but that's what people are fighting against, like inviting the government and big companies in to moderate their content more, for the most part, is a bad thing in a society that is fairly repressive. It's actually that the internet, that is the thing that was there to protect you from the censorship and was an opportunity for freedom of expression that you hadn't had. So I honestly think there's a really big kind of divide between the kind of now mainstream digital rights space in the West and actually what the mainstream looks like outside of the West, which is not a kind of pro content moderation, at least to the same degree that I think you see in North America and Europe. I think there's still some of that because obviously there are problems like the Rohingya issue and the way Facebook contributed to that as well. So there does need to be some, but I think it's definitely and that's why you find actually a lot of popular support for what, Elon Musk is doing, which is in some ways it's a bad solution to a problem, which is that it shouldn't require, only some people can have $44 billion up their sleeve to make this kind of intervention. And I would like to think that out of what we do, along with hundreds and thousands of other groups, is actually trying to do something much more democratic about having free and open source software and open platforms to do that. So I think it's an intervention that was needed because I think Twitter was getting way too trigger happy on the content moderation. But long term, this is kind of these elite solutions essentially that aren't really what we should be going for.
But it's still the whole Twitter of it all, or titter, as some of my favorite podcast people like to say. What is then, I mean, when you think about who should control the conversation online, what is that line between incite, saying things that I might find incredibly offensive? We did have somebody that used to run this place a couple of years ago who just said things. I mean, it was just, what is a right? You have the right. What is the right? It goes back to fundamentals, right? Freedom of speech. At least in this country, the First Amendment, should we be controlling content online? We don't want to be seeing beheadings. We don't want to see snuff films. How do we think about this then? Are you, in your own mind, whatever you end up doing after this, is how are you thinking about, how do we think about this other world that no one really had any idea when we created it, what was going to happen?
Absolutely. Well, I think we're all trying to work that out. I think what's become evident over the past few years is that we've overcorrected. That's my assessment, is that there absolutely is no denying huge problems with speech online. I think there's been an overcorrection, and actually that has real world consequences in terms of, well, in some ways, what oftentimes turned out to be misinformation about the pandemic, for example, and what people were being told at the start by the official guidance ended up being wrong 6 months later. But Twitter and others were taking it down because it was considered misinformation at the time. So that's obviously huge in terms of when you're dealing with a pandemic. In some ways, I think you're just talking about lesser evils at the end of the day. And I think the lesser evil is free speech, because once you have a kind of small group of people managing and controlling what you can and cannot say, the way that can be weaponized to control society at large is a much more terrifying prospect than, obviously also incredibly difficult individual acts of, tyranny and repression that happen between people. So I think we're still working out. We're at an interesting moment. I think the Elon Musk thing is really a kind of major pivot point in the conversation that in some way has been, I think, very much dampened down. And again, as I was saying before, it takes someone with access to $44 billion to kind of push through how heavy that has become in terms of the kind of content moderation faction, let's call it. And I think there's more to come. So I would hope we're kind of pulling back to something that's a bit more of a middle ground, but there's a lot of work and conversation to happen in terms to work out what is the right way to do this stuff to protect people on an individual level, but not set up a kind of tyrannical content moderation or censorship system on the flip side.
17 years ago, you started building this thing. It's brought you all over the world. I remember when me and Priscilla would work for Ashoka, or we worked for, the Skoll conference or TED or any of these places. Those groups generally started to build a group of people. The Ashoka fellows are connected. If Ashoka disappeared, they'd still be connected because they talk to one another.
A network. Yeah.
Does that network spring up for you with your group?
Oh, absolutely. And I would say that became one of our primary kind of things that we were doing through these events. So field building, we kind of have five main areas that we work in, which are research, content distribution, open technology, training, and field building. And the field building is all of these networking events where we would get 40, 50, 100, 150 people. Once or twice we've done big conferences, like we were the co-partners of RightsCon, which is a large conference that we did in Manila. Right. But for the more part, it's kind of these bespoke or boutique kind of events that were much more about, gathering people for a very intensive 5 to 7 days outside the city so they could develop very, very strong relationships, sleep in bunk beds and have to have cold showers and eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner together and hang around the fire in the evening, which you'd think, what does this have to do with digital rights and open and secure technology? But actually the philosophy or the idea was this is the relationships are foundational to all of the rest of the work. And you need trust and a shared set of understandings and goals so that to enable people to work together. The quickest way to do that is essentially to throw them all in the deep end together and see what comes out. Is very much about breaking people out of their groupings that they might otherwise feel quite comfortable in and stretching them so that they have maybe they actually can be uncomfortable. It's and that's actually where the growth is, so that you'll find someone from Fiji and the Philippines and Myanmar at the end of an event kind of crying and hugging together because they've all made these really great friends that are going to continue on for ages, and they'll also build collaborations together as a result. So that's been 100% a huge aspect of the work that we've been trying to do. That's why I said earlier, in some ways become, for a while, we're kind of more of an events management organization more than anything else. COVID obviously put pay to that for the time being. But that was very much our MO, was how do we build these relationships and shift people's perspectives so they get out of their I'm this group, you're that group, we don't work together, but actually, and which is also kind of counter to a lot of the, where the zeitgeist is at now. It's much more about breaking down barriers and kind of pushing people into the spaces that they're most comfortable in.
But that's the bubble. I mean, that's the unintended consequence, right, of what happened with the internet in now, and the pandemic certainly pushed things forward, but people are in their information bubbles, because you're talking about the great activists, the leaders, the human rights activists, but the rest of the billions of people that live on the earth that have access to the internet is dividing. And so the irony is this thing that was going to make us all connected, because I mean, it's interesting to think about the work that you've been doing for these many years. It's great work. What we do in the digital world, but it ultimately has to go back and impact the world that we actually live in. So even if you're spending 24 hours a day or 23 hours a day online, you still have to then lie down and you still live in the world that you live in. Do you think about sort of those interactions and how our analog or our real world life has changed and been impacted, particularly with things like disinformation, particularly with, the kind of repressions or control of information? How do you think about that now? Do you think, how have you grown personally in these many years?
I mean, the immediate answer that is coming to mind is actually saying that I don't think I've grown a lot. In some ways, I've actually stayed a lot the same, and I feel that some of the ideas that I initially had around freedom of expression and open and secure technology and being critical very early on of big platforms have borne fruit or been shown to have been actually quite valid in terms of that approach. I mean, probably a lot of my biggest learnings were much more just around leadership and management and how to kind of construct and build a nonprofit organization, but also very much intercultural as well in terms of how we build a team in Thailand versus how we build a team in the Philippines versus how we build a team in Indonesia, because everyone has this kind of cultural firmware that is baked in to a degree, but also flexible too. And the people are also individuals at the same time, and how to kind of bring all that together, which isn't just a challenge for me and them, but it's also, how the Bangladeshi team works with the Filipinos, et cetera, because they also have different ways of communicating and engaging with each other as well. So it's definitely given me a perspective of categories are useful to a degree, but you also can't overly box people in terms of how you think about them, because at the end of the day, they're also still individuals and you need to treat them as such. And I think to connect that to the kind of fracturing work is that, the internet essentially, put us into these bubbles or into these kind of algorithms that essentially mean we don't encounter enough difference to the degree that we should. And so we have these, circular loops that reinforce our belief systems and we don't go out of it. And now we have a kind of peer policing system where if you suddenly went, might have a little bit of a question about this restriction or that restriction or whatever it might be, or is that 100% true, that issue, then social media will discipline you. Essentially, there will be people out there, and that has really damaged the conversation greatly because it's created an increasing level of conformity, actually,
and fear
of retribution and
cancel culture,
yeah.
right? I mean, the whole we interviewed somebody last year. She was like, it's so easy to be a bully online where nobody can see you and we can all throw stones, and it's a horrible thing. We'll get through it hopefully, but there is the critical thinking, the sort of idea, the wrestling with complexities and nuances. It's the next phase of thinking about how this world is impacting.
And at the end of the day, you come up with worse solutions because people who might be kind of pointing out, I don't think that is quite right. Like you remove some quite helpful information that needs to go back into the system in order to, course correct. And if you don't have this ability to course correct, or it's severely diminished, then you're going to go into territories that are not going to be helpful to actually solving your problems. And that what's weird or what's different is that really used to be a problem of the right. We were doing work in 2008 or 10 or 12 or 15. It was the kind of conversations about online bullying were, and I say this as someone who's been in the progressive space for 20 plus years, were really about what the right was doing. What shifted was that at some point the left decided that this was a tactic that it also found helpful to advance, to shortcut in some ways social change, and actually leave out the conversation part of it and the changes in the subjectivity, and actually just kind of go more Robespierre, get a bit more Jacobin on the whole process, and that will kind of get you there more quickly, and maybe it gets you a couple of milestones down the road more quickly, but actually what it also does is produce an enormous backlash as well.
It certainly didn't work out very well for Robespierre.
It did not work out very well for Robespierre. Well, and then you had Napoleon, right? And so you have this counter reaction. You have to bring people along with you. And that's a long and difficult process. And for people who've obviously been more marginalized, that's a difficult prospect. Like why should you be more patient? I totally understand that perspective. At the same time, if you don't bring people along with you, then from a strategic perspective, then you are creating a massive counter reaction. And what looks like, and you're in the States, not me, but what it looks like is that a massive counter reaction is coming when you have your midterms. And then that will be another setback at the end of the day for what you would like to happen. So again, these course corrections, if you can't course correct earlier on, then you go down these pathways, and that seems to be where things are going.
If you're dreaming about the future, what is a more just society? What is it? We know this ribbon of human rights is blowing around the world. It seems to have been maybe dropped in the ground recently, but we do know that society is more and more reaching out for human rights. It can be water, it can be the internet, it can be food, it can be various degrees of issues. But if we think about that, what does a more just society look like, and how do we find it? So many groups here. You're talking about Robespierre, American Revolution. You always have people struggling, mightily. Like in the reversal in the French Revolution was a disaster. At the founding. At least for the people who were there, right? Like, what does a more just society look like in Myanmar or any of these, the Philippines? In your mind? I'm glad I don't have to answer this question.
That would be great if I could bring my colleagues in at this point. I mean, it's all in those contexts. It's also different because the way that it happens is so different. I mean, in Myanmar, it literally looks like people that we know from previous life are popping up on BBC stories who are now hiding. Have gone and joined insurgencies in the jungle. That thing, like that's a pretty extreme shift from kind of being an urban kid, doing graphic design or whatever you might have been doing in Yangon, to somehow, being in the jungle and wielding a weapon. Yeah. But obviously that's not necessarily going to get them where they want to go either as well. There's kind of cycles of conflict there, although obviously on some level you could also understand, given the extremity of the situation, how it's got to be a pretty extreme situation for someone to end up in that kind of context. I think, and maybe this goes back to the learnings, is that maybe it is a little bit more of slow and steady wins the race. It is intergenerational shortcuts, and they don't always work. They have other kind of unintended consequences within them. I think it's a lot about the co-creation and the conversation. It's about changing people's subjectivities at the end of the day and their relationships between each other. So when we talk about social change, I mean, social change is a certain configuration of relationships and understanding between people. So if you're going to, at the end of the day, what you need to change is people's minds, right? And if you force that, then you're not actually creating social change. I mean, you might be from an infrastructural sense, but you kind of, you're forcing it, and it's going to kind of come back at you at some point as well. And I think the other thing is to note that it's not like a lot of progress also hasn't been made as well, even though it looks like Marcos Jr. might be coming to power in the Philippines. The Philippines also did have a revolution in 1986 and got rid of a dictator, and has had, I mean, I think also the thing is to acknowledge that there is significant progress. I think that sometimes doesn't happen as well, and that if you go back 70 or 80 years, every country apart from Thailand in Southeast Asia was colonized. Right. And there was obviously an advance where the colonial powers were thrown off. Some dictators came to power. In other places, there was a certain element of democracy. So I think overall, not that we should have too much of an optimism bias either, because that can lead us down the wrong path. But overall, it has become better. Also, certainly in terms of economic well-being and people's access to basic things like health and food and shelter and things like that. Like that has been an amazing level of progress. You don't hear about people starving.
As much.
Southeast Asia.
You hear about it, but
not in other parts, still in Africa and some places, and obviously it's going to be very interesting, and hopefully this kind of inflation of food shortages conversations and realities that are starting to hit is not going to take us back in that direction. Certainly the productive capacity is so incredible now in terms of what you can do to create food.
Right.
that you really hope we don't go back down there. So there has been, so the short version is to also look to the past in terms of the fact and acknowledge that improvements have been made and that it's not a kind of zero-sum game.
So thank you so much for coming on. You're in the future, so let us know how it's going.
Yeah, will you come back to us?
The sun is still shining, so don't
Give us
worry.
a heads up, like if something's coming, like a meteorite or something. Just let us
know. If you're having, as you evolve your thoughts, as you go to the next thing you're going to do, please come back and tell us about it.
Yeah, we'd love to
absolutely.
hear what
We'd be
you're
very
doing.
happy to speak further.
Yeah, great.
Great work. Thank you for everything.
Yeah, thank you, Priscilla. Thank you, Jesse.
Okay.
Nice to meet you both. Cheers.